So first of all, thank you, Amir, for everything, for inviting me for this lovely introduction. I'm very moved. And I had a wonderful month here in Stanford. It gave me the opportunity to have so many discussions and exchange of ideas and to enjoy the great archive and the special collection. So thank you very much for everything. And thank you for Khan and for Roland for everything, for all the small details that make such a thing, so to say, make it possible for me for being here. So thanks. And I miss my glasses. A confiscated memory tells the story of Haifa. In 1948, Haifa, a mixed city in British jargon, became a Jewish city. This is much known. Just how much this costed in cosmopolitan flair, in internationality, is rather less well known. The afterlife of the city's past history following 1948 has, however, been largely ignored and is practically unknown. That is what this book is about. Only on the surface is it a mycological study telling the story of a city. In truth, it addresses the macro level, the country and the state of Israel. In this book, the history that was meets a history that could have been. The counterfactuality I have deliberately chosen does not seek to disregard what happened, to ignore historical contingency. It allows the narrator to play the past off against a future that has become the present. Two milestones mark the history of Haifa, especially the history of Wadi Salib neighborhood. The first was the riots among the largely Moroccan Jewish population, which have become an icon in Israeli history books. There were two waves of violence in the summer of 1959. They were firmly put down by the police, and as a direct consequence, the government set up a commission of inquiry which drew public attention to the rifts between European and Oriental Jews. What seems to have been more or less forgotten, however, was that until 1948, Wadi Salib has been a relatively intact Arab neighborhood. Arab Haifa died in an instant, within a few days of April 1948. The abruptness of this transformation was probably responsible for the distressing gap between the perception of Haifa as a Palestinian symbol of the Nakba, disaster, catastrophe, and the self-proclaimed and well-established image of the city as a picture book example of Jewish-Arab coexistence. To gain an historical perspective on the subject, the course of events need to be halted and reeled slowly back. This gives us a snapshot of the previous residents who disappeared so abruptly, but who have left their traces in the city. For those less familiar with the history of Haifa, it should be explained that Haifa consists of a series of topographical layers, each coinciding with a certain social character. As the 1959 Commission of Inquiry was told, each stratum on the slopes of the hill is higher than the one below, both topographically and socially. This book tells about top and bottom, both topographically and socially. My argument follows the movement of a pendulum, looking at selected points of Haifa along the seams and dividing lines that still exist long after the circumstances that gave birth of them have vanished. A suitable point of departure for the swing of the pendulum is the neighborhood of Hadar Carmel, halfway up Mount Carmel, the place where the tomorrow of yesterday lay. The development of the area was a move towards modernization that accelerated the urbanization process. Although Jews, most of them Oriental in origin, had already lived in Haifa in the small enclaves Hart el Yahud and Ard el Yahud at the turn of the century, it was not until Hadar Carmel was built that Zionism set foot in the small Mediterranean city of Haifa. Inspired by the English garden city, Hadar Carmel was at the time considered a model of urban planning. It was built in the 20s on land belonging to the Jewish National Fund and managed by a cooperative society. From the outset, it presented a marked contrast to the Arab neighborhoods on the slopes below. This difference manifested itself explicitly in the extensive use of public space for the benefit of the general public. A clubhouse, a library, and premises for the neighborhood committee were among the public buildings planned soon after the founding of the district. The extent to which planning took the public good into account was shown both by the establishment of the Technion, a national educational institution, and the provision of infrastructure for welfare, health, culture, and religion. In the early years, Hadara Carmel was subject to general urban planning guidelines, under which the neighborhood was classified as a residential area, while the older Lower City alone was earmarked to provide the commercial and industrial infrastructure of the city as a whole. The outbreak of violence in 1929, although less devastating in Haifa than in the other mixed cities of Palestine, showed the potential for conflict that for a time discourages Jews from entering the largely Arab Lower City. The original plan for a Jewish garden city served by the commercial and industrial structures located in the Arab downtown were shelved. As the national conflict intensified, it proved impossible to ensure regular food and water supplies for Jewish residents. Soon afterwards, from the mid-30s, the two parts of the city were already functioning independently of each other as separate systems. Escalation of the national conflict exacerbated the trend towards segregation between residential areas on the basis of religion and origin. National tensions found expression in conspicuous demarcation lines between Jews and Arabs, both among the old established population, which at the turn of the century had still lived in mixed neighborhoods, and among new arrivals and immigrants. These two trends, growing segregation and intensifying incongruence in urban planning, were closely interlinked. National tensions led to the abolition of mixed structures and to greater segregation in the new Jewish neighborhoods. The decision to free themselves from economic and financial dependence on the Arab neighborhoods compounded the plight of the Arab quarters and intensified hostility. The historian Weiss notes a distinction between the haves and the have-nots, tracing the progressive impoverishment of Palestinian society in Haifa. According to Saikali, the have-nots experienced political and social discrimination intensely and retaliated in the 30s with militant action. Some sought security in their Muslim identity, which had grown stronger with migration from the country to the city, and which promised religious solace in the face of material need. Witness the sermons of Sheikh Izzadim al-Qassam at the El Istiklal Mosque on the periphery of Wadi Salib. This picture shows a dichotomy between the neglected Arab city and the developed Jewish city. In urban development, it manifested itself in the contrast between Hadar's Technion and Benjamin Park, regarded in the 20s and 30s as the most beautiful square in the country, and the corrugated iron shakes of the Arab quarters without sewage system or water. As Josef Waschitz put it in an unpublished manuscript, and I quote, "Although they lived under the same government, the Jews were subject to the British mandate, whereas the Arabs were subject to a quasi-colonial regime." End of quotation. On closer inspection, however, Waschitz's picture is a less dichotomous one than that painted by Saikali. He discerns a dual society in Haifa under the British mandate, in which the only contacts were economic. The political order was dictated by the British Empire. Political institutions were in constant conflict with one another, and strict separation prevailed in education and society. Washit's analysis the cleft between the various levels in terms of a conceptual separation between government machinery, political system, and civil society. In the absence of a sovereign state, however, such categories are only partially valid. The strength of Jewish civil society and its close and effective links with the Jewish political leadership stood in stark contrast to the relative weakness of an Arab civil society overshadowed by the Arab political leadership. The hesitant modernization process in local Arab society provided little incentive to create institutions which played a central role in nation building within Jewish society. And there was practically no move toward internal integration. According to Washit, Arab society was politically more strongly consolidated than it was in the civil domain. The cosmopolitan nature of the city exposed its Arab inhabitants to other residents, both Arabs and non-Arabs, of various origin and belonging to various religions, thus paradoxically intensifying Arab national awareness. The Arab political elite, however, showed little interest in current economic and social problems. Until well into the 40s, it ignored both the growing poverty and the problems of workers and the dualistic reality of Jewish-Arab cooperation. It might well be the duality Washit describes, expressed in the many contradictory links between Jews and Arabs, that makes it difficult to convey the demise of Arab Haifa of the 22nd of April, 1948. The discrepancy between clarity and ambivalence means that the custom narratives patterns fail to capture the event. It is not difficult to explain the military defeat suffered within a single day on April 21 after the fighting that had been going on since November 29, 1947, had driven half the Arab population out of the city. But historians find it extremely difficult to understand the decision of the Arab municipal authorities embodied in the self-styled Emergency Committee of the Arabs of Haifa to reject the capitulation conditions dictated by the Jewish side represented by the Haganah, and to call for the evacuation of the Arab population, every man, woman, and child. The Jewish and British officers presented the announcement in the city hall were reported to have been shocked by the Arab decision. According to Jewish and British sources, some tried to dissuade the Arab delegation from making such a terrible mistake. But the decision has been taken. Reportedly, still during the capitulation talks, Shabtai Levi, Haifa's mayor since 1940, made an emotional appeal to the Arab Emergency Committee to stay. The members of the Jewish delegation immediately backed his plea. However, the consternation of the Jewish leadership soon dissipated. In the course of the weeks that followed, and even before the British left the country, the Jewish leaders withdrew their appeal to the Arabs. It's good without Arabs. It's easier. Everything changed in the course of a good week. A Jewish observer is quoted as saying a month after the event. The city hall of Haifa, located on the borderline between Hadar HaKarmel and Wadi Salib, marked the transition between epochs, from the imperial to the national age. The figure of Shabtai Levi alone may have contributed to an illusion of continuity. Born in Istanbul, where he studied law, Levi spoke fluent Arabic. In 1940, he succeeded the former mayor, Hassan Shukri, also a graduate of Istanbul University. Confusingly, the minutes of the municipality continued to be kept two languages, Hebrew and Arab, which did not reflect practical realities. Of the once 70,000 Arabs in Haifa, only about 3,000 had remained. Life in the city had fundamentally changed. A look at the Wadi Nisnas neighborhood allows us to reconstruct these existential changes. In 1948, the remaining Arab population of Haifa which had been widely scattered throughout the city, was moved to Wadi Nisnas. Without consulting the civilian authorities, the military leadership had decided to concentrate the Arab population of Haifa in Wadi Nisnas, which had been built at the turn of the century by wealthy Arab Christians. The decision provoked considerable criticism and bitterness. Implementation began once the British troops had withdrawn from the city on the 30th of June 1948. The civilian authorities warned that this decision ignored civil consequences. To no avail, the measure should be seen in the context of an internal power struggle between the civilian authorities and the military leadership. The apparent continuity of an Arab neighborhood cannot hide the fact that forced resettlement largely destroyed religious and communal structures among Haifa's Arab population. It cut off the Muslim population from its religious and cultural infrastructure, such as mosques and cemeteries. The measures carried out in late July 1948 were seen by the Arab population as arbitrary and unjustified. Some even described them as ghettoization. As so often, however, there were also unintended consequences. The measure, originally planned on military grounds, meant that in the longer term, a vital Arab milieu developed. Over the years, Wadi Nisnas grew and developed beyond the divisions between Muslims and Christians into a desirable middle-class Arab residential area of Haifa. This development was understood differently by Jews and Arabs. From the Arab point of view, and in stark contrast to the conditions of its emergence, living together in Wadi Nisnas created a Palestinian national identity based on historical awareness. In the eyes of the Jewish inhabitants of Haifa, the bustle of vibrant urban life symbolized the often evoked Jewish-Arab coexistence. It is probably because of the nature of the discrepancy that Zvil Kimlicka has described as differential citizenship that this Arab folkloric patina, municipally subsidized and flaunted, blinded the Jewish majority to the 1948 tragedy of the Palestinian minority and its persisting civil deprivation. Whereas Wadi Nisnas, the present-day Arab quarter of Haifa, represents the exception, Arabs who remained in the Jewish state and in the predominantly Jewish city, Wadi Salib, evacuated in 1948, exemplifies the rule. Its erstwhile Arab residents fled and with their descendants now probably live in Lebanon or in Syria. Under an Israeli law of March 1950, they are termed absentees. This definition applies to everyone who after November 29, 1947, that is the date of the UN resolution of the division of Palestine, became a citizen of one of the 7 Arab states that fought against Israel, who resided in one of these countries, or who left their regular place of residence in Israel and moved beyond the national borders or to a place within the borders that at that time was occupied by hostile forces. Under this law, as amended in 1953, their property, termed absentees property, was confiscated and appropriated by the Israeli state. For a brief space of time, in the spring of 1948, it looked as if Wadi Salib would have a different fate. It was intended to be the Muslim quarter in the Hebrew city, but its strategic location at the eastern approaches to the city spoke against this plan. For as long as the war continued, a concentration of Arabs in Wadi Salib was seen as a threat. Shortly thereafter, it was the small number of Muslims, only about 500 had remained in Haifa, which spoke against the need for a neighborhood of their own. Nevertheless, the area did not remain uninhabited for long. Immediately after the flight of the Arab residents of Wadi Salib, Jewish immigrants and refugees moved into their abandoned homes. Some had been allocated accommodation there, others occupied premises spontaneously, some obeyed official instructions, others disregarded them. It was only in 1959 that Wadi Salib and its inhabitants entered the annals of Israeli history. Its residents, mainly recently arrived Jewish immigrants from Arab countries, chiefly Morocco, who had come to Israel in anticipation of Moroccan independence, rose up against the social injustice and discrimination prevailing in the country. In deciding to move into former Arab homes in the lower city of Haifa, which had now been declared absentees property, they had gone against the grain of government plans. From 1951 onwards, the Israeli government had planned to settle the scattered members of the diaspora who were streaming into Israel in peripheral areas of the country, namely along the borders, a project which was only partially successful. From the mid-50s, the most enterprising of the immigrants abandoned border areas and moved into the cities. Quite contrary to its intentions, the government now observed how the abhorred melachs, the Jewish slums of Morocco, were being reborn in the abandoned Arab residential areas of the former mixed cities. Wadi Salib became an icon of sorts when in the summer of 1959, social protest among these immigrants escalated into a wave of unrest directed against the local public authorities and the urban Ashkenazi social democratic establishment. Violent confrontation between the police and the residents of Wadi Salib exposed the tensions within Jewish society, between immigrants and old established population, between Israeli Jews from Islamic countries and those from European countries. These tensions would subsequently be labeled the ethnic problem. In 1959, the fact that Wadi Salib had been an Arab quarter only 11 years previously had apparently been forgotten, despite its Arab name, and although the protest was mainly concentrated in the former Arab quarter of Haifa. This fact was also overlooked by scholars such as sociologists, anthropologists, and historians. All this discipline tended to externalize the Jewish-Arab conflict and to consider it and the Palestinians themselves as a separate domain rather than as an integral part of Israeli society, which regarded itself as exclusively Jewish. However, a careful examination of the events of 1959 shows that residues of the past were indeed apparent. Take, for example, the decision of the demonstrators in 1959 to march from Wadi Salib up to Hadar Carmel to vent their anger on shops and businesses that had nothing to do with events in Wadi Salib. In their eyes, Hadar, the typically Ashkenazi neighborhood, symbolized the middle classes, and located in the immediate vicinity of Wadi Salib, it presented a convenient and easily accessible target. It seems that the social alienation and economic gap between the two adjacent neighborhoods had already made their mark on the urban topography in the 20s, when Hadar Carmel had been built beside, above, and autonomously from the poor Arab quarters in the lower city. Whereas social tensions had already existed in the days of the British Mandate between the Jewish middle class and the impoverished Arabs, in the 50s it divided the up-and-coming Ashkenazis from the destitute Oriental Jews. The rundown condition of Wadi Salib, which had been one of the triggers for the 1959 demonstration, had to do with its status as absentees properties. The ownerless housing had been neglected, and the obsolete and dilapidated infrastructure from the Mandate period had neither been repaired nor rehabilitated. The gap between the haves and the have-nots, between Ashkenazim and Mizrahiim, was thus also partly due to the events of 1948 and to the distribution of abundant Arab homes. Whoever came too late came off badly. David Ben Harouche, the charismatic leader of the Wadi Salib riots, summarized these circumstances in his statement before the 1959 Government Commission of Inquiry as follows, and I quote, "When the immigrants came in 1948 during the time of mass immigration, the best houses were occupied by the Haganah, and when they vacated them, they were handed over to people from Europe, who now occupy them or have passed them on to others." End of quotation. His statement reveals the suppressed fact that the distribution of the property of Palestinian refugees continued to cast a shadow over those who benefited from the spoils. The major role that arbitrariness played during the forming of the sovereign Israel became clear in the violation of the principle of inalienability of private property and the extent to which this injustice overshadowed relations between Jews. In my book, I have employed a spiral structure to characterize how urban development in Haifa has been determined both by topography and deliberate urban planning. Since this procedure is difficult to convey orally, I took recourse in this talk to a pendulum movement. Before concluding, I would like to point to the forced repetition of history that the end of Wadi Salib represents. The end of Wadi Salib was a direct consequence of the 1959 riots. It was the Government Commission of Inquiry that recommended clearness of the slum. Through persuasion, but also with a great deal of cunning on the part of the authorities, the inhabitants were induced to vacate their homes in Wadi Salib and move to new housing estates. Although this procedure reflects a general preference in the 60s for suburbia, especially in Israel, but also in the West, the clearing of Wadi Salib certainly had deeper roots. This can be traced back to 1937, in the mid-mandate period, to the plans of the so-called Haifa Committee, which had been set up by the Jewish Agency to induce the British to abandon the recommendations of the Peel Commission to accord Haifa the status of an international city. As such, it would not have formed part of the future Jewish state. The report of the Haifa Committee dealt explicitly with Wadi Salib and the Arab lower city. It recommended buying the centrally located neighborhood from the Arabs with an eye to constructing a modern central quarter in the future. The original Arab resident, it was recommended, should be resettled in healthier surroundings near Haifa. To counter possible criticism of the harsh consequences this recommendation would have for the Arab population, the Commission argued in 1937 that the location of these areas predestined them for rapid urban development which the financially weak Arab population would be unable to shoulder. In the interest of Haifa and of general progress, this central neighborhood should be left to those who would welcome the rapid development of the city and who were also financially capable of bringing this about in the best possible manner. This ambitious plan, drawn up in 1937, was naturally not put into effect during the mandate period. With the plight of the Arab population in the aftermath of the 1948 war, it finally became obsolete. But then, contrary to all plans and intentions, the area was settled by new immigrants who ironically came almost exclusively from Arab countries. The social unrest of 1959 presented a welcome opportunity to eradicate Wadi Salib Oriental character and finally to incorporate it into the long envisaged modern central district. However, a modern central business district alongside the port of Haifa has still not seen the light of day. The former Arab residential areas still appears to elude Jewish modernization plans. The derelict site of Wadi Salib, vacated in the 60s, still lies alongside the ruins of the Arab Old City, destroyed during the War of 1948, including what remains of the Hijaz Railway, which at the turn of the century provided the first impetus to the modernization of Haifa. The scars of the city have not healed, the wounds are still visible. The present-day cityscape reveals the shortcomings of amnesia. My book tells of places and not least of people, of their fate during flight and migration. The counterfactual perspective arose from my desire to give Haifa's inhabitants, both its present and above all its past residents, their due credit in history. This has hitherto been denied the historical neighbors of today's inhabitants. My choice of this counterfactual approach is strongly motivated by the sense that the poor city once
Thank you very much, Yfaat, for a fascinating lecture. When we talked before your lecture, we thought that it would be best to continue from here, not so much in a Q&A manner in which a speaker stands on stage, but rather as a conversation, as a seminar on a fascinating story. So with this, I'd like to invite your comments, your questions, your remarks, and see who ventures to jump in. Please.
I'll jump in. Can you give a sense today what the Arab culture is like in Haifa? Are there Jewish professors at the Technion? Are there Jewish doctors at Rambam?
Arab.
I mean Arab, I mean Arab.
Palestinian.
Yeah.
Shall I start?
As a seminar.
As a seminar. So we just, I was thinking about it in, maybe I would say, I was thinking about it in the last 1 or 2 years, and in few opportunities where we had the opportunity to discuss Haifa within, so to say, Palestinian colleagues. I will still come back to the question how many colleagues, how many Palestinian colleagues there are, but still with Palestinian colleagues and historians, sociologists, and I would say that today, Haifa is probably, in terms of successful, the most successful mixed city. Even though I won't use this definition of mixed city, because the definition in itself is a definition for something else. I mean, it's the British definition for a city in a Mandate time where the, so to say, the demography would have been something like half-half. So we are not talking about half-half today, of course not, but we are not talking anymore about 3,000 among 70,000. I guess today, in today's Haifa, there are something like 12% Palestinians, Arab Israelis. I mean, the definition is a topic for a discussion in itself. Now, in the sense of labor market and in the sense of prosperity, I guess that Haifa today, again, is much better than, for sure, Jaffa. Not to be compared with Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is another story, because the civic status of the Palestinians in Jerusalem is not the same as the seemingly equal status of the Palestinian of Haifa. So in this sense, as one colleague said, and I cannot quote him because he said, if someone will quote him, he will say he never said it, but for sure it's the better place. I mean, for sure it's the best mixed, kind of mixed city in Israel today. And this has to do with the fact, with many facts. I think that it has to do with the educational system of Palestinians in Haifa. Now, the educational system of Palestinians in Haifa is good because most of them avoid the state educational system. So their private educational system is better than the average state educational system in Israel. So in this sense, many of them, or the middle and high middle class, get better education, and in this sense also better positions. But just to say, it's a story of paradoxes. It's not because of intention. Sometimes it's against intentions. So it's the it's the outcome of initiative against intentions.
Just now, you alluded to that difficulty, that tension between what's actually desired and what's said, which is one of the great fissures in actually reconstructing the history of the emerging Israel. There's been so much work done on how the statements of, say, Ben-Gurion can't be taken at face value, because what is it that he really wanted as opposed to what it is that he actually said in terms of what the configuration of a state would look like, demography, the presence of Arabs, etc. I ask this because I wonder if you could flesh out what the mayor was feeling when he made the statements. Who was he? What sort of place did he desire? What did the flight mean to him? And to what extent his sentiments were singular, to what extent they were an expression of a kind of larger group of Jews in Haifa. The myth of Haifa, as you alluded to, looms so large. It's the place where it should have worked out, but it didn't. And I just wonder how he, what he said, what he felt, what evidence we have, how you reconstruct that story.
So, thank you, Stephen. I might start by saying that I personally prefer, so to say, a functionalist, a structuralist measure how to deal with this history. So, in a sense, I am not so much a concentration on the statesman, the ideology, and the utopian, all kinds of utopians. So actually, what I tried in the book, and in the book it's I mean, I could elaborate much more about it, is to look for how it worked, not how it was, what was the rhetoric. But I still use the rhetoric of Shabtai Levi. And may I turn your question and say, starting by saying that I really believe that he was extremely ambivalent. Shabtai Levi, the person Shabtai Levi, that there was a kind of Osman layer of the city, and Hassan Shukri, the Turkish Muslim, the mayor till 1940, and Shabtai Levi, the Jewish Osman, that they were two Osman and shared a kind of shared tradition, and in this shared tradition, life among Arabs was very natural. So as Shabtai Levi died and Abahushi turned to be the mayor, this epoch came to an end. But I think that for us as historians, what is even more important and difficult is to say, what can we do with these kinds of rhetorics, with this scene in the city hall? Shall we ignore it altogether and say it's a myth? Shall we try to look at it and ask which kind of ambivalence is there that this can happen? I mean, it's much more of ambivalence. What I tried in the book is to compare the historiography and to taking from the one side people like Ephraim Kirsch and very, so to say, kind of very Zionist historiography, and on the other hand, to look at Palestinian historiography and to see that at the end it's not so far from each other. It's really a story of ambivalence, and a story of among the leading figures, a story of people who were very much interconnected and closed and colleagues, and still decisions were taken by both sides. So how to let this rhetoric be there and still work with this material in a way that it's not reproducing kind of myth. This was, so to say, my challenge in the book.
See, already two, yeah. Then I want to go first, and then you.
I lived in Israel, in Haifa, from the early 70s and early 80s. And I guess maybe I brought into that myth. I mean, I started off in Europa and Bakalim, which is at a lower level, but was, Jewish. But then we moved up to the Carmel, and there's also like an Arab village that's right there, on the Carmel. So there's like a Jewish neighborhood that connects to Kabadir. And I didn't have a sense of enmity. I didn't feel like there was like a sense of enmity between the Jews and the Arabs that were living in the town. My kids went to nursery school, and it's true that it was the assistant nursery school teacher, but there was like a Jewish, Ganenet, leader, and there was an Arab Ganenet. And I had friends that had friends over the house, and they included like a mixed couple. The one was Arab and one was Jewish. So I think, and now my oldest daughter is like co-director of the New Israel Fund in San Francisco, and every year they pick two young lawyers. They bring them as fellows over to the United States to work with international lawyers for human rights. So I went this year and I met, it was like an Arab young woman, and an Arab Muslim young woman, and a Jewish young woman. And the Arab woman had said that she did live in Tel Aviv for a while, and she moved to Haifa, and she feels so much better living in Haifa because she doesn't feel the same. She feels more accepted. She doesn't feel the same sense of discrimination that she felt in Tel Aviv. So it does seem to me that there's some reason for buying into that myth. And when there was the Intifada and places were attacked, it was often an Arab owner, co-owners, an Arab and a Jew.
For sure, today Haifa is the better place. Nothing, as I said in the beginning, but, kind of a but. And maybe I will answer with an example, which for me was a kind of eye-opener, because I grew up in Haifa. We grew up in Haifa as well, and I think that we were blind for some things. And I will take a kind of Haifa myth, and if, I don't know, who knows how. In Haifa, in the middle of Haifa, there is a wonderful, beautiful house. It's in the Crusade Road, and it's the Suidan house. That's the name of it now. Suidan, Beit Suidan. And people normally in Haifa what is Beit Suidan. It's so beautiful. It's very special. It has a kind of extravagance. You can't miss it. I grew up. I mean, it's great. The Suidans, and they have this family of merchants. So beautiful shop, wine, and cheese. And so international and so beautiful, and the Suidans were in Haifa for 48 and after 48, and they still live in the beautiful Suidan house, and so everything is great, such a prosperity. And and then I decided one day just to go and look for the Sudan house, just to take this kind of the exceptions of the exceptions, the happy end story of Palestinian in Haifa. And it turned out that the happy end, so to say, story is not so happy as I used to think. That in 1948, the Sudans, who were Christian Arabs, they were always actually they were pro-Zionists in their actions. They were pro-Zionist in the sense that they preferred, for their own reason as Mercants, they worked in 1929 with the Zionists against Muslim population in the city. So these Sudans, who were very, very loyal Christian Arabs, very loyal Zionists, turned out that in 1948 they were all spread all over. So part of the family was in Egypt and part was in Lebanon. It took them a while to get everyone back to Haifa, a while and a lot of violence. They succeeded at the end, but it was very harsh. Anyway, their house was taken, confiscated. So the wonderful Sudan house, which for me was always the symbol of continuity, was confiscated. It was clear confiscated and partialized into small pieces. I mean, it was a kind of bourgeois lifestyle. All of a sudden, in this wonderful building, they didn't get it back. They bought it back, piece for piece. I mean, it took them years. I don't know. So now it's again Sudan house, but I have to say it's again Sudan house. So how would we judge this kind of story? I would just only say that we shouldn't judge the thing by the surface. And we should not take continuity as I mean, it's not so easy with the continuity. Some succeeded, and you might see a kind of success, but the success is not as outcome of the intention, but sometimes unintended or against plans and intentions. So just to...
Thank you for a wonderful book and a wonderful lecture. I read your book in Hebrew, but your talk was just as insightful as the first reading of the book. And my question is about the sense of continuity that maybe serves as a very foundational myth in Israel. And I'm referring here to, I'll use Yoram Kanyuk, who recently passed away, an Israeli author that wrote in his 1948 book, one of his latest books, about the scene when the Arab citizens fled out of Ramle and Lod in Israel. And he has this stark image of how the Arabs are fleeing, being kicked away, whatever we want to term it with, and how immediately, as he juxtaposes it in his creative authorship, the Holocaust refugees are being brought into the houses. That's a sense of continuity that serves, I believe, as a foundational myth in Israel. And your book, I feel like, throws a different light on this sense of continuity. The intentionality of replacing one set of refugees with another. It seems like it wasn't that smooth as we like to maybe think about it. They maybe were forced away, but it was for a very good cause, and these people needed the space, so maybe it was worth it, or maybe, I don't know, outdoes it, or whatever you want to call it. But your book gives a very different picture of how this continuity worked out in the Israeli, in the specific case of Wadi Salib. If you can say something about it, how this transformation was maybe a little more than we would like to think about it, between the sets of refugees.
So thank you, Anna, for a kind of enable me to make a kind of fine-tuning, in the sense that I had to decide by giving a lecture what to skip over. I mean, you cannot put every, and I decided to leave the aspect of the Holocaust survivor out of my talk, because this would be a kind of another discussion, even though it belongs it belongs to the story. So maybe maybe to say that what I try to avoid in the book, and I think that's also here in the talk, is to turn chronology into causality. Besides the fact that the Holocaust survivors were the first to so to say, to inhabit this property, it doesn't turn it into a kind of causal explanation. It's not about an explanation. I mean, it's about the chronology, and this was the chronology. And I think that what I tried, and we talked a little bit about it before the lecture, what I tried to do is to integrate the entire picture, also in the sense that it was very short after the Holocaust, and they were there, and they means the Holocaust survivors were refugees, and they moved into houses of refugees. And once you try to tell this thing, it's always the question for me as a historian and narrator, how not to turn out a kind of a moralist in this kind of story with no moral, in a sense. And I think that I was actually very much assisted in a very weird way by Ghassan Kanafani and his novel. And I don't know how much this novel, Ghassan Kanafani, I don't know how much this novel is known here. Return to Haifa, I think. Return to Haifa. And Kanafani's novel, written in 1969, is telling a kind of story, kind of a homecoming of a Palestinian who from Ramallah to Haifa, just to find that in his apartment a Holocaust survivor is living, and how to come to terms with the fact that she is there. I mean, and and it would be hard for me to say much more about it than just to realize the facts of these layers, one after the other, and let, so to say, all kind of, in this sense, all kind of victims or losers of the history be part of the entire picture, not necessarily playing them once against the other, but letting them be once near the other in the narrative, just taking the advantage of the historical narratives. That in the historical narrative they can all be there. You don't have to, so to say, to make a kind of a decision. It's not like in the event itself. In the event itself, they are not all there in the same time. They are one after the other, and on the cost of the other.
My brother-in-law is a transit wizard, and he has a coffee table book showing the official transit maps of every metropolitan transport authority in the world. And they're ordered in size, and so the first three are, I believe, Moscow, London, New York. Guess what the last page in the book is? Right? It's the little funicular in Haifa. And one of the things that happens in politics is who gets the transit stops and who doesn't. And every city has that where it expands. And I wonder, we've ridden that little cable car innumerable times, and I always got more and more nervous as I went toward the bottom, and I didn't know why. Do you know anything about the interaction between the politics of the Haifa subway and development?
No, I won't be able to.
The Carmelite?
No. I won't be able to say more about the Carmelite.
To be researched, to be studied, I guess.
Yeah, a whole new area.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, in a way, I also want to thank you so much for this. And in a way, it's related to this question, but maybe to shift you to an infrastructure that's in your field. That's to ask you about your sources. As a historian, you were mentioning much of this material that you were discussing here was in reconsidering historiography. And my question is, I'm really curious about archives on site. And point of clarification, are there parallel archives of municipal communities, or has there been a movement to consolidate? I'm just curious about where you found your sources and what the state of community or communalism is in the historical record.
Thank you, Alan, very much. And I would say that actually about few topics I didn't get any archival sources. Maybe to start with it, I didn't get any and couldn't find any archival sources for the Holocaust survival in Wadi Salib. Because the welfare department of the archive of Haifa didn't want to let me into the welfare records. And I thought that's the only way to find a Holocaust survivor as such in the Wadi Salib will be in the welfare record. So I don't know why they were against it in privacy, but I mean, we all know how to work with private records. So they didn't let me in, and I didn't have anything. So I had to look for the Israel Bank, Bank Israel, so to say, material, and try to reconstruct how did they move in and why did they move out, and to look for the connection between them moving out and the German reparations. So I think that they moved, I'm quite sure, that they moved out of Wadi Salib in the moment they started to get reparations from Germany in the beginning of the 50s. So I could look in the records and see how much investment in real estate was among the reparations. So that was a kind of, this was for the Holocaust survivor. So for the Palestinians, I did have records in the State Archive of Israel. I didn't have Palestinian records. I guess later on, when I worked together with Palestinians on so to say, a joint project on Haifa, they added a little bit of so to say oral documentation. But the so to say the normal or the usual documentation was in the Israeli state archives, and in this sense I had nothing more to say than I would say Benny Morris or Tom Segev, or it was only the interpretation that I added to this file that was, I think, already looked by both of them. I might mention both of them. I think that they are the most important historians for these specific events. Now, in the case of the Moroccan Jews, for them I had a lot of material. And I had a lot of material because of the Clearance Act. I mean, the entire documentation of the Clearance Act was to be found in the Technion of Haifa, because it was a subject for many research in the 70s. So I got a lot of materials, interviews with Moroccan Jews, and it was, in this sense, great for me, because this kind of oral material in a written version kept a kind of, I would say, authenticity, because it was just the transcription of oral statements. And it could be added to a commission of inquiry, which had a huge amount of material, and where, among other people, you can get the feeling of Israel of the 50s, and I mean, how Oriental Jews were so to say, treated by the establishment. This is quite surprising for us. I mean, what was, so to say, the normal tone by handling these kind of topics. And the best, I would say, the best source was David Ben Arush in the committee of inquiry. And this has to do, I guess, with prejudice on my side, being an Israeli, I mean, raised up in Israel in the 60s and 70s, that David Ben Arush, I would say, was almost the most eloquent person in the entire procedure. So to see this kind of eloquence and this very clear opinion and very deep understanding of what's going on. So this was more or less my sources, and means part of it was in Jerusalem and part of it was in Haifa, and that was it.
We have Chaim, Adi, and Steve.
Okay, could you say something about the University of Haifa? Our participation in the student body and the faculty, and its role in analyzing and interpreting Palestinian history and situation in Israel.
Maybe take all of our questions.
What?
Maybe take
Collect
all
them?
three, yeah, maybe.
Okay, Yfaat, shall we collect all
Yes,
three?
what we
Okay, so this is about the University of Haifa, and if the University of Haifa, if I understand correctly, Chaim collects data and analyzes it about Arab-Israeli
situation in general.
the situation in general. Adi?
Yeah. I hope you won't find my question too politically contemporary. So you started with the 1989 events, but most of the discussion concentrated in the Palestinians, which is obvious. But I do feel that it reflects a convention today in Israeli society that we can't have both stories. We need to talk about the ethnic tensions or about the national tensions. And I want to know whether you think that it is indeed the case. Perhaps we can talk about these two stories together, and this will actually help both conflicts. Because in order to, in the discussion about Mizrahim and about Palestinians, the fact that the Mizrahim came from Arab countries is pretty much neglected. And perhaps remembering that will help also the national conflict. It's too political.
My question, I want to press you a little bit on your distinction between being a moralist and a historian. It's a distinction that I very much sympathize with. However, when one writes history, one chooses sides. You were choosing sides. Even ending with the word poignancy meant that there was a certain degree of choosing sides. I was thinking about your description. I haven't yet read your book, but I will right away. But I was thinking about how, say, when I write about Russian Jewish history, say, just right now, the Kishinev pogrom, I can understand the sentiments of the Russian right. I reconstruct them in my work. I use archival sources in order to do it. And then implicitly, I show that they're wrong. I don't say that they're wrong, but the reader walks away feeling that they're wrong. That's not my primary intention. That's a kind of oblique. I take it for granted Solzhenitsyn's reconstruction is simply wrong. I cite him, I deal with him, I read him. Implicitly, he's wrong. If one were to, those of us who work, say, in interwar Poland, will take the argument that there's a huge population of Jews, why privilege them socioeconomically in a poor interwar Polish state, et cetera, and one implicitly, most of the people I know, however sympathetic to those arguments, implicitly conclude that they're wrong. There is, as I hear you, and I thought the talk was very impressive, there is to some extent, even if you don't use the terms, I mean, quite wisely, there is wrong and right in this story, even if it's not stark, even if you allow for the fact that there is a poignancy in the survivor of one catastrophe ending up in the home of a survivor of another kind of catastrophe, tragedy, whatever term we want to use, even if we don't speak of it in symmetrical terms. So I just wonder, when I know you've thought about these things. Can you just think aloud about how you thought about these things?
Okay.
Can I add just very small?
Very small.
You mentioned the Palestinian colleagues, so I wanted to know how much support is there for their work on similar topics? Of Palestinian colleagues' work on these topics? Is there support for it? Do they do it? Do they, yeah.
Okay, so I try.
Is their work seen as legitimate?
Okay, so I'll just try to answer all of very shortly, but to give a kind of an answer for every question. So just starting by saying that the university, I used to teach in the University of Haifa till 2008, and there is a Jewish Arab Center, but I don't know what do they work about. I'm sure that they do work about kind of contemporary topics, but I cannot. I don't know what is. I do not follow the publication. I'm not sure that they do have a kind of so to say a serial of publications. There are people at the University of Haifa who works in the entirely other direction. Demographs, very known. I would say very unpleasant kind of work about numbers and very.
It used to be Ilan Pape, so you go to that.
No, Ilan Pape, yeah, Ilan Pape is not anymore. There, I don't want to go about to talk about the Tantura case and so on. It's extremely important topics, but this would need another kind of. I mean, another kind of how to evaluate. Oral history in the case of, I don't want to go into it, so sorry for that. Now, Adi, as you probably know, the book works against a kind of one-sidedness, and I try in the book very hard to tell both. Let's say both stories, the Oriental Ashkenazi and the Arab Jewish one, and to tell them in kind of parallel. And I was working, I had to admit that I worked very hard about for the design. At a very long time I didn't know how to solve it, how to tell two stories. And as I almost gave up and thought, so I'm going to solve it with a font. And I will tell I will tell the one story, the Oriental, the internal Jewish one, with a black letter. That would be in the top, because this story is quite clear. And the other story, the Palestinian, which is vanished, and the amnesia, I will tell the amnesia in the bottom in a gray letter, and the reader will make his or her own decisions how much of the black and the gray he can handle it. And this is at the end not the solution. I mean, I had to find a kind of a solution and make a kind of a fusion, but. As the book came out in Israel, it was, I would say, it was almost ignored by Oriental colleagues. I would say ignored. They didn't attack it, but they ignored it. And as I thought that there is a kind of system in this ignoring, I understood that it works against their identity politics. So for their own identity politics, I shouldn't take the 1959. I should leave the 1959, the Moroccan, and leave it Moroccan, so to say, not to bring it back to its Jewish-Palestinian roots, which I find very hard. And
they identify themselves as Arab Jews, isn't it?
Yes.
Actually, the
yes, but when they I think that sometimes, and some of them, and I don't want to generalize, but sometimes and some of them like to label themselves Arab Jews. But once you're an Arab Jew, there are consequences for this. It means you have to deal with the fact that all not only the Zionist entity, but also the Moroccan Jews lived on the coast of the Palestinians. So once you have to admit that it's you yourself living on the coast of the Palestinians, it's not very easy, and especially if this is such a central argument in your own identity politics. So I can understand it, even though, but still it was a very surprising experience for me to see that it's so hard for them to handle it. Now, Steve, to your question, the moralist against the historian.
You can be brief, really.
How can I be brief in this question? Okay, so I will be very brief, because you ended up with Poland in the interwar period, and I will just agree with you that Poland in the interwar period is the most interesting case of comparison for Israeli politics, even so today. I think that this is the most, I wouldn't say it's similar, of course it's not similar, but as in a comparison, it's a comparison which makes a lot of sense. And if we agree that the most unpleasant thing among many unpleasant things in the history of interwar period Poland is the nationalizing nationalism, if we do agree about this nationalizing nationalism, which means to take, I think it's a Brubaker category. Right. If we agreed about this forcing the minorities in all respects, in aspects where it was necessary, and in aspects where it was not necessary, to force all kinds of policies. So I will say that, of course, in the sense of judgment, I am not very sympathetic to these procedures of nationalizing nationalism. And I think that for sure the state of Israel, starting by the state, this is easier because not to personalize politics. So the state of Israel could have treated the Palestinian citizens better in the 50s and 60s, in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, and okay. So in this sense, of course, there is a kind of judgment, but I have to thank a colleague, which we know both of us, and this is Elazar Barkan. First time I presented this paper, not this paper, first time I presented, so to say, the nutshell of Wadi Salib, in a conference where he took place, and it was the very, very first version. And at the end, he came to me and he said, "You have so much sympathy to the Holocaust survivor, and to the Palestinians, and to the Moroccans. So what about the Haganah? Try a little bit to feel sympathy to the Haganah. It will make your narrative so much better as a historian." So I did my best. I did my best, but not in a cynical, not to be cynical about it. I did my best in the sense that the book never argues that the events themselves in 1948 could have been different in the sense of the war. I mean, that the war was avoidable, no, I take the war as a war, and where the, so to say, the moralist, not as a moralist, is present in the book, is of course in the feeling that something absolutely wrong happened after 1948, and that is also the case vis-a-vis the Oriental Jews. But here again, a kind of but, and this goes back to Adi's question. But I will never compare. I don't think that it is comparable. And I thought very long about terminology, how to avoid a similar terminology to the way the Israeli state treated the Palestinian after 1948 and the way it treated the Oriental Jews. So the argument of the book, and this would be the very last answer, I guess. The argument of the books is not so much, and not in a vulgar version, a kind of Orientalism. Oh, the Ashkenazi, Mapai, the Orientalists, the way they treated the Palestinians, they treated the Moroccan. No, this is not what the book is arguing about. It argues about layers and about living one after the other in the same place and about state mechanism and it's a kind of integration of internal and external Israeli history aspects that were always dealt separately. But it's not the argument of as if it is the same, so to say, category of events, and as if, so to say, ethnic cleansing, let's name it an ethnic cleansing, I guess it is a kind of ethnic cleansing, ethnic homogenization, is similar to mistreatment on a kind of internal differences between Oriental and Ashkenazi Jews. So was it kind of satisfying?
But thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much.